spoof the source address in a UDP packet anymore if you're transmitting from the HAR network. But that didn't stop you guys from trying, because as you can see in the graph, there's a little green spike on Thursday evening. Some people tried to actually attack the cache that we have, but no one succeeded, so unfortunately I can't hand out a pie. But we're very sure that if we had 6 weeks of this excellent conference here, that someone would have won the pie, and I'd be happy to give it to you. Now, we've had a look at all these vulnerabilities that are in DNS. So is there maybe a solution that we can implement to actually mitigate this attack? Well, it turns out that there is a solution available today, and it's called DNSSEC. Many of you may have heard of it. Some of you may know the details of it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that now. Now, DNSSEC was developed by the IETF, and it's been actively developed since the mid-90s. So it's been going on for a long time, and nothing much has been happening with the deployment up until the point that Dan published his attack last year, when suddenly some people realized, hey, maybe this is something we need to do. Now, what DNSSEC does is it makes it possible for you to check whether you've received a valid answer, because actually there is a digital signature on the DNS records that you can get back, and you can validate this digital signature, and if it fails to validate, then you've been given a wrong answer. It's also important to note what DNSSEC does not do for you. It does not provide confidentiality. If I'm looking at, if I'm creating a resolver and I'm really interested in www.nakedwhatever.com, people can still see this. It doesn't provide me any confidentiality. And it does not protect me against other threats, such as denial of service attacks, which are also a major issue. I mean, if the DNS doesn't work, the internet is broken. At least that's what users think. Actually, DNSSEC makes this a whole lot worse, because the packets, because the digital signatures are in the answer packets, they are a lot larger. So actually you can scrap the D in distributed denial of service, because I can now attack a server from one end system, because the packets are such a lot larger. Neither does it prevent people from making typing mistakes in their DNS zones. I mean, it doesn't guarantee that the person who's actually typing in the records doesn't make any human errors. Now, I'm sure all of you know what RSA is, so I can probably skip over this. But just a quick recap. DNSSEC is based on public key cryptography. So I use a private key that I keep for myself to sign the records. And I have to publish a public key that people can use to verify the signatures on the packets that I'm sending out. Now, how are these keys used? This is not something that is specified in the standards, but it is common operational practice at the moment. People are using a two-tiered key model. There's something called a key signing key, which is a rather large key for security reasons. It is something like a 2048-bit RSA key, which has a long validity that you can use for a year or longer. And they use it to sign a second key, which is called the zone signing key. Now, this is the key that I actually use to sign the zone. Now, signing in DNSSEC takes place at the zone level. I either sign the whole zone or I don't sign it. There are some exceptions to this, but that is basically the idea. And because some zones can be really large, I want to be able to sign a zone quickly, because it might be changing often if I'm operating something like a TLD or I have dynamic DNS updates. So I need a smaller key to be able to achieve the speeds that are necessary to keep re-signing such a zone. So this zone has a much shorter validity, because really 1024 bits RSA isn't that secure anymore. And I use that key to sign the resource records. Now, what happens if I sign my DNS zone? What does it look like in my zone? Well, I get some extra resource records, because actually, as I told you before, I need to share my public key with the rest of the world, otherwise they can't validate my answers. So I need a DNS key record, which actually shows you the public key that I use to sign this zone is this and this and this key. And actually, I also need to be able to do something with delegation. I'll get back to that a little bit later. So there's also a DS record, which my parent zone can put in its zone to actually show that it can certify that my key is actually the valid one for my zone. Now then, there's an extra record that you will be getting back if you query and you ask for a DNSSEC answer. You will get an RRSIG record, which is the signature on the research record or research records that you requested. And finally, I need to be able to do authenticated denial of existence. So remember, those of you who know DNS, if you ask it for an answer and it doesn't know the answer, it says NX domain, I don't know the answer to the question you're asking me. Well, in DNSSEC, you really want to be able to tell the end user that you don't know the answer, and you actually want to prove that you don't know the answer. So to do that, you use something called NSEC or NSEC 3. Now, if you do DNSSEC, your zones will become quite a bit larger. Now, if you have a small zone, that's not an issue, but if you are operating a TLD, that actually has quite an impact on your operating procedures because you need more memory to store your zone, you need more bandwidth to serve it out, etc. Now, what actually happens if I want to validate a DNSSEC response? Now, in this example, I'm using the www.nist.gov because actually the US government mandates the use of DNSSEC since late last year. And I can actually query nist.gov and I will get a signed answer back. Now, how do I validate this signature? Well, I need to know what key was used to sign the nist.gov zone. Which in this case is indicated in the RRSIG answer. The first bit says 156, that's the key ID that was used to sign that record. So I need to look up that key. Now, whose job is it to do that? Well, your resolver should be checking these answers. But how does it find the key? Well, it can query for the DNS key record, but how does it know that it can trust that key? I mean, I can publish a zone, put any public key in it and say, well, that's my key. And I could spoof that. So how do I know that I can trust the NIST.gov key? Well, I'm going to answer that in a bit, but first I'm going to show you a little bit about the current state of deployment because that is necessary to be able to explain the rest of my story. At the moment, DNSSEC is deployed on some TLDs, some smaller and medium-sized countries. Some TLDs.org has recently been signed, I think in June. And the US government has actually signed the .gov domain since January 1st this year. But what's more important is that some really large TLDs, .com and .net, VeriSign has announced that they are actually going to sign these big TLDs. And that means that, well, something in the region of 65% of all domains, it will be possible to deploy DNSSEC on them once this has been done. And they have actually committed themselves to doing this hopefully before 2011. And as Dan Kaminsky mentioned last night, it would be really convenient if the root would be signed. Because, well, actually, if the root isn't signed, how am I going to build up the trust? Well, the good news is that the US government and ICANN have announced that they're going to do their very best to sign the root before the end of this year. And that's been quite a strong commitment, so I'm hoping that they won't crawl back and say, well, it's turned out to be really hard and we're not going to do it. The bad news is that there's a lot of politics involved there. Many people are either opposed to the root being under control of the US government or VeriSign doing the operational work on that. But I'm